Welcome to Awesome Talk Interviews. Tonight, we have a very special guest. Seez Mics is here tonight, who we love, and we're going to talk about his album he did in collaboration with Cubbiebear, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and we're going to talk about a whole lot more. Thank you so much for being here, Seez. This is great.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. I've been a fan of your show for a long time. I know Josh was a big fan. I know you were big fans of Josh, and I just feel like there's a certain amount of synergy to having me on here. So thank you. And thank you 100%. for accommodating my child's schedule.
No problem at all. It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure.
You know, Rick and I have both talked about you and Teddy Faley and Cubbiebear on the show. Every time music gets brought up, every single time, I'm always like, chat room, if you don't know who these people are, please go and listen. This is the shit you need to be listening to. But for anyone who is unfamiliar, you know, Cubbiebear was a great musician. Unfortunately, though, he is no longer with us. And you know, posthumously, this album came out, and I listened to this, and I think about that you had, you know, your hand in all of this to make it happen, based on the things that I've read. And there's one thing that I think about a lot when I imagine what that whole process might have been like for you is, you know, and maybe I'm thinking about this based on the fact that Rick and I have lost a lot of people in the last like 7 years, I just want to ask you, how are you okay? Because not only did you have to go through the process of losing someone that is dear to you, but then you are, you know, I've seen recording sessions and mastering, and you're listening to the same thing over and over and over, and then you're doing interviews about it. And so I just wanted to ask, how are you doing? Because that has to be bittersweet and maybe sometimes hard.
Yeah, it's a very empathetic question to ask. I appreciate you asking. You know, I'm doing pretty well with it. There's a lot to unpack. So to your point about so just to be clear, so the record is actually, I would say, a collaboration between Cubbie and I. So I grew up in Maryland and was the MC in a group called Educated Consumers from 1999 to about 2014. And we were really well established in the DMV area. And Cubbiebear in the early 2000s was, I guess you could say, we were a similar version of him. He was a similar version of us. He was based out of Baltimore, but he was an MC and a producer. I was just the MC. There was a guy making the beats in Educated Consumers, Jay Bombi. So eventually Cubbie and I crossed paths because I was getting a lot of shows, or Educated Consumers was getting a lot of opening slots in DC. Cubbie was getting those same shows when they would go to Baltimore. So we became friends and allies in terms of making music, and over the years talked about making a record. We were both, you know, wrapped up in our individual projects, him with Cubbiebear as a solo act, me with Educated Consumers, and then eventually as Seez Mics as a solo act. So we had a handful of songs that were sort of like half-baked cookies. We did 2 songs that came out on proper records, Hooray, and then Constrict and Release. I feel like there was something, Ahead of Myself on an Educated Consumers album. So anyway, so to your point about how I'm doing with all this stuff, in August of 2016, Cubbie was diagnosed with the stage 4 brain tumor and wasn't given a whole lot of time to live. So he wanted to get, among a lot of other things that he wanted to do with the time that he had left, he said, let's really get cracking on this album that we've been putting together. Because the first song we did together was Hooray. And it's funny because when people hear the album, like, yo, this song is dope. I'm like, yeah, that was the first one we made. It was all downhill after that.
That's both Rick and I is one of our favorite songs ever. Yeah.
It definitely was one of those lightning in a bottle kind of moments. But, you know, sort of the joke was like 10 years later when Cubbie got diagnosed, you know, that was what lit the fire underneath us to finally do the record. So, you know, he and I interacted quite a bit over that. He passed in May of 2017. So that's, I guess, 8 months. And during that time, you know, we certainly had our conversations about what he was facing, and we also had our laughs just hanging out. But we always had this thing that we were working on. But pretty quickly, I'd say within 4 months, his health had declined to the point where he wasn't able to do a whole lot. So what the album was supposed to be was he was going to do all the beats, and then we would both be on all of the songs. And after he passed, what became clear was of the songs that he and I had done together, those were in the pocket. Like, everything that Josh had done vocally for those, everything was fine. You hear this happen with a lot of athletes where like something tragic happens and they focus on their sport, and it's sort of the way that they keep their mind off of it. In a weird way, not long after Josh had passed, that was sort of how, not that I kept my mind off of it, but that's how I processed it. That's how I dealt with it,
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, it was just pushing the emotions down. Like every now and then, obviously, I would be listening to one of the songs that I had done with Josh, hear his voice, and then that would bring back some emotions. But after he passed, there was a handful of songs that I was just doing by myself over his beats. And, that was a fun process. Obviously, I wish he was here to work together so I could bounce ideas off of him. But eventually, once the album was done, so all of my parts were done. And before I go any further, I got to say big ups to DJ Cam One. He's a very talented DJ and producer based out of Baltimore, but he's also a technical whiz. So after Cubbie had passed, Cubbie has a brother named Bill. Cam got in touch with Bill and said, I'd like to get access to Josh's computer so I can get these files that he and Seez had been working on. And then he was just able to work his magic and get all of those out, because Josh had a very unique approach and used a pretty, maybe archaic's too harsh a word, but a piece of software that not a lot of people use to make music. So Cam got it up to speed where I was able to go in and re-record a bunch of stuff. At Cam's suggestion, actually, to re-record stuff. So,
and at that point, were you under the impression that there's a chance those songs might have possibly been gone or unretrievable? Did that ever go through your mind as a possibility?
To be honest, no. I mean, I think that I didn't really have time to consider that, because it was like I knew once we got the computer, it wouldn't be impossible to access the files. What I was more concerned with, what we would just get this pile of shit that no one could figure out how to make. But I would be so stubborn where I was like, it sounds fine, and it wouldn't sound good enough to be what Cubbie would have wanted, and I would have just been stubborn about it. And then, I guess falling off the cliff on the other side would have been there was nothing there. But, be that as it may, we were able to get it to the point where the album was done. And so just to backtrack a little bit more, Josh or Cubbie, so Cubbie's real name is Josh. I might, go back and forth between those two names. He had always had a good relationship with Sage Francis and Sage's label, Strange Famous Records. And so did I. And so in 2000, I want to say 14, 15, maybe it was 16, maybe it was 17, I joined Strange Famous's digital imprint, SF Digi. And after Josh had passed, I approached the label and said, it could be a while before this record is ready. Would you be interested in it, when it does, when I am able to put it together? And they said, absolutely. I kind of knew they would, but, it's definitely one of those things where I wanted to make sure that it was going to have the proper platform before a lot of people put a lot of time and energy into it. So once we got that okay, it was balls to the wall. And so when the album was done, and, circling back to your original question, once that was done and all I had to do was administrative stuff in terms of talk to the label about getting the artwork done, how were we going to do videos, how are we going to do the mixing and mastering, those were sort of like mundane tasks that I was no longer in a place where like I could avoid the emotions of Cubbie having passed, sort of like, and I say this with all intended love. I knew that I was actually dealing with my emotions where I was like, I have like a wife, 2 kids, full-time job. It just got to a point where I was like, I'm so fucking tired of doing all of this stuff for the album. And then, the guilt would set in, like, you're doing it for Josh. But I don't think it's like this existential crisis that I was experiencing. I think that's just a normal feeling when there's something that takes a long time and there's a lot of work. And in some ways I thought it was healthy to have that perspective because I wasn't burying myself and what I had to deal with Josh in doing those things. it wasn't until, so for particularly now, with everything being digital and so, I don't know, like, I guess ephemeral would be the right word. Like, it's here and it's gone. It's here and it's gone. It's fleeting. Yeah. So what people want to have is a really concise but long write-up about records. And it's funny because I started doing, the first person I did this was for Josh. He hit me up and he had an album called Forced Back to Sleep.
Yeah, great album.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
That's one of my favorite albums of all time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So he said, I don't want to write about my own album. Could you do the write-up of it? And so, I remember thinking, like, I really enjoy writing all kinds of stuff, poetry, prose, jokes about football, rap, all kinds of stuff. So I enjoyed the challenge of it, but it was certainly one of those things that was easier to do about somebody else's record. So when I sat down to write this, I wasn't able to be like, this is this song and here are what these raps mean. I just wrote, I didn't want to sit down and write something over the course of like 6 weeks. I just wanted to sit down once or twice and just write everything out that I could. I was crying while I was writing it. And what I started to do was just a narrative and what I tried to do in chronological order of my relationship with Cubby. And then couched in that was a discussion of how the album would be, some of the songs and other people that were involved in making it. So that was really where I went through the gambit of emotions. And I think I came out on the other side of that because I only gave myself 2 sessions to sit down and write that. The first one was just bleh. The second one was, I want to tighten up some of the transitions between thoughts and some of the grammar and stuff. But it was really the first time. I really don't like when other people edit stuff that I write, but I really trust the people at Strange Famous. The guy who runs the day-to-day operations of the label is Storm Davis, and I've known him, before I even met Sage. So I said to Storm, I don't want to spend too much time editing this. Could you do it? And then whatever you decide will go up on the website and you use for promotional stuff. I'd like to do that because I just want to move on from this. And so what he put up, I didn't actually read the final version for a week or so after the release, and I had written it. There wasn't a whole lot of changes, but that's when I think it hit me where I was like, now I'm not dealing with Josh's passing. Now I am dealing with it. And, listen, it's not like there weren't, like the night that he passed, I was definitely very upset, but also, had this conflicting feeling of relief because he was in pain, and, I try to get that across in the write-up that's on strangefamousrecords.com. You should go check it out. I think that's a pretty normal emotion for people to have when a loved one's been suffering. And if you've ever experienced that, there's no guilt or shame to it. So, I've talked to my wife and to my kids are very young, but I still wear one of Josh's cancer wristbands. My daughter is 4, my son will be 3 soon, and they're old enough to ask, what is that? Where did you get that? And so I'll talk to him about my friend Josh. And I think throughout those interactions, I would say that I'm fine, and I appreciate you asking me. And I'm sorry that was such a long answer to it.
It wasn't. That was a great answer.
I was going to ask you how. It's a little bit in the same vein, but you are sort of responsible for juggling a lot of this, and you sound like you're dealing with it okay, but you also have to. I imagine you also have to talk to other people, family members of Cubbiebear and friends. And how do they all respond to this idea of putting out this album after he's passed? Or is everybody excited about it? Are they emotional about it? Like, how did that happen?
Sure. So, and one other person I definitely have to mention is Alexander Brown, who's also on Strange Famous Records. So he and Josh were friends and worked together on a bunch of stuff. And Alexander Brown's a very talented musician. He produced Grace, which was one of Sage's most popular songs, and he's got a lot of records of his own. So after Cam had done like 75% of the mixing and mastering, it was still pretty raw and somebody needed to touch it up. So Alexander Brown, who was going to do the mastering, offered to tweak some of the mixes. It's funny because, and to your point, Rick, about I had talked to Sage, I talked to Josh's brother, I talked to Teddy Faley, I talked to DJ Addict, all these people that were on the record. I talked to Barbara, all these people that were on the record. And then to have this new person to talk to about it, Alexander Brown, there was such an enthusiasm in him that had been, from everybody. It's just, we had been working on it for so long.
Sure.
That I wouldn't say the enthusiasm had tampered down. It just had taken a step back. Whereas with Alexander Brown, particularly, we were at like the 20-yard line, and Alexander Brown, just blocked everybody into the end zone. That's what his role in the album was, to get that fresh enthusiasm was sort of like that jolt we needed to just keep mixing up the sports metaphors to cross the finish line,
Sure.
But talking to his brother, to Josh's brother, Bill, he was always on board. Josh's mom, who I haven't seen since Josh passed, we made sure to talk to her about it. And, everybody was on board. It's one of those things where, I just as an MC, everything that I want people to be like, this is amazing, but there's also this sense that I've never had on this album, probably because I'm a selfish jackass, but where, I'm like, this is so much for Cubby's fans, because, I miss the days of having like a 3-month ramp up of promotion for a record, but people don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Beyonce dropped an album at midnight, and like 6 years later, no one's doing promo campaigns.
Right.
So I don't think any of Josh's fans knew that this was coming. And, there is that aspect of it where I'm like, fuck, like, I hope it doesn't we didn't drop it and then it gets washed out to sea without people finding out about it. I hope it's still making its way to everybody through the ripples. But between family and fans and friends, I think everybody's very excited that the album's out, and very excited that it's as good as it is, because I think it's really good.
It's great. Yeah. In fact, I think it was actually our last show. Teddy Faley was in the chat, and we had brought up this album, and I said, when the world loses an artist, part of what's lost is all the art that they would have contributed to the world had they still been here. And like, that's a loss that is really unique to like a certain type of person, a creator. And I thought it was really special for fans to be able to have an unexpected, like, little bit more of a creator who isn't here anymore. And that's amazing that was able to happen. I think that's like something that we probably wish we could get, with lots of people that are gone, to be able to make that happen, and sort of not just you, but everyone involved to be able to harness that, like the power of what that means to put that together, just friends and loved ones. Like, that's really special and amazing.
I feel like Prince, after he passed, there's been music that's come out, like Tupac. There was music that came out, obviously.
Tupac comes out with a new album like every 6 months.
Right. Makes one wonder. But I'm wondering if there's ever been, I'm sure Dilla, they probably did stuff like this with Dilla, where after he passed, because he was making the beats, people were able to get the beats, and then MCs jumped over it. I don't think there was a song on, so the album with Cubbiebear and I that's available on Strange Famous Records it's called Even in Death. And I think, so the title track, Even in Death, it's the last song on the album, and actually the first song that we did the video for. The video is available now. Peace to Shawnee Cameras for doing that. I think that's the only song that Josh and I hadn't at least discussed while he was still alive. Obviously, the songs that he and I are both on, I'd like to think we talked about them, before, during, or after we actually did the songs. But the other ones, typically what I would do was I would write a verse and a hook and say, this is the direction where I see the song going. And I always wrote I've always written pretty quickly, particularly to Josh's beats. You know, I've told people this a number of times. Hooray was the first song we did together. I've always written quickly, but typically I'll say, all right, give me the beat and I'll go back to my layer. And, you know, like I used to smoke cigarettes. So I would like, I'll start writing until I feel like I've gotten where I can go with that, go smoke a cigarette, think of something, come back. I haven't smoked in a long time because it's absolutely disgusting. But, you know, after Josh passed and sort of the posthumous work that comes out, it was more of a collaboration. I guess people did record like what was the album people did with Frank Sinatra where they were playing off of his shit, you know, like after he died. This album's a little bit different than that, but
there's not as much crooning.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a fun thing.
So I have a question. So you have a very long creative history with Josh, and I think that's really important, and it's unique, and it can be a volatile relationship. It can be a relationship full of ups and downs. And I was in a band for like nearly 20 years, and I can remember the first creative moment and how exciting that was as a kid. I mean, I was like a teenager when we started that, right? So your first creative moment with Josh, I was wondering if you could talk about that and what that was like for you and what happened.
Yeah, so that's where I was going before I began bashing my microphone with my feet. So he, you know, his production style, as you guys know, you're very familiar with his catalog as a whole. For anyone who's listening who's not, I definitely recommend Cubbiebear, Cubbiebear. I think it's a little late for me to be spelling, but he had such a unique approach to producing, and I'd always wanted to work. So the guy who did the beats for Educated Consumers he had a very traditional hip hop boom bap style, and it was, you know, awesome. It was a great style to work with. I'd always wanted to try sort of like not rap rock, but sort of like the almost like a 9 Inch Nails, but not like biting their styles type of shit, you know, like that sort of edgy, you know, sharp cut, you know, there's such a visual component to Josh's music. And when I met Josh, I was really solid in my foundation as a writer, and it was easy for me to pivot from one style of beat to the next without, you know, going to, you know, like crazy offbeat, you know, approach to rap that just wasn't my style. I was able to transpose my style onto what Josh was doing. So to your point, the first time we ever really hung out to work on a song was when he played the beat for Hooray, and I remember sitting in his apartment and writing it. I never do. That's the only time I've ever done that, not really had to edit it. I've done a lot of work with the guy named K Chromosome. We used to get together at his apartment and just like get all kinds of fucked up and write. And, you know, like the first like hour of it was great until we were both kind of fucked up, and then we'd have to go back and edit. You know what I mean? Like go back and edit. But with Josh, 32 bar verse, I mean, that's the first thing we did. I remember that was one of the first times. So that's an interesting song in that it's 2 long verses, and then there is kind of a hook, but not really. And that was the first time I think I really done that with the song, where, you know, traditional rap structure was 12 or 16 bar verses, 4 or 8 bar hook, a lot of repetition. And then with Josh's stuff, that's not the direction I took. And that was sort of an eye-opening experience. And, you know, to your point, Rick, like just, wow, you can do this, this will work. And, you know, it was another thing where I think Josh I'd worked with other people who made the beat and also were going to rap on the song. But because I've always been worked pretty quickly in terms of writing stuff, I don't know that I would say I typically take the lead. I just end up like going first kind of thing. Right. And, you know, when Josh did his verse, it's the same length. He did the same kind of thing with the hook. Like it was cool to see him, you know, see the direction that I had laid out and do the same one. Cause I think symmetry is a big thing, you know, in life and OCD, but, you know, particularly for rap music. So the first song on the album is called All Friended Up. And I feel like All Friended Up is like an updated version of Hooray.
Okay.
The same kind of thing, you know, it's 2 long verses but in a unique way that neither ever feel laborious to listen to me. Like, they're pretty long verses, and I've never tuned out. I've never heard somebody say you might want to cut that down, in the same way that Hooray worked that way live. And Hooray was just such an awesome song to do live.
I can't believe you said that those verses are that many bars, because it's funny that you put it that way. When I think about it, yeah, I think you're right. I think that it is that long, but it doesn't feel.
I shouldn't have said anything.
Feel like that. It doesn't. No. That's good, man. Like, that's because when somebody writes like that, what it means is that you're so hooked, you're so on the edge of it, you can't get enough of it.
Yeah.
So it feels like it can't possibly be that much, you know. Plus, that beat is just fire. I mean, yeah, that beat's amazing.
And if I remember correctly, so there's been people I've worked with that would send me beats as they like, this is a 90-second loop of the sample. And so I'd start writing to that, and then I'd say, you know, here's the hook and the verse that I have, or just sort of where I'm going with this. And then they'd loop it, you know, for 4 minutes, and then I would record, and then they would go in and make the changes, pull the drums out, you know, maybe inflame the bass line or something like that. I think Josh, when he made a beat, it was like this obstacle course that was already laid out in front of you. And I think that's one of the reasons that A, it was always a thrill, and B, why I did it so quickly, and C, why it doesn't get boring, because when you have that terrain to navigate, it makes you change up your flow or do something a little clever 8 lines in, so the audience doesn't have a chance to sort of start yawning, you know?
Sure.
That's really interesting. It reminds, I had a question about your writing outside of rap. Your like, you have a book of poetry out, that's been out for a while, and it made me wonder, because I've said in the past that I thought that Josh was probably one of the best writers that I could think of, like a modern day writer, not just a musician. I thought that a lot of Rick has said, like, especially when Forced Back to Sleep came out, I remember Rick saying, it feels like I'm listening to someone read their diary. It's almost like something you're embarrassed to hear someone say, or think someone should be embarrassed to say, because it feels so personal all the time. And I wonder, how would you say that writing, if you were sitting down to write poetry or prose, or I don't know if you do like spoken word, that's not music based, how does that speak to your writing for music versus how does being able to write for music speak to how you write for poetry specifically?
Yeah, great question. So just to backtrack on one of these things. So I completely agree with what you're saying about Josh in terms of, you know, his approach to rap music was along the lines of people like Atmosphere, or sort of the more open book, emotional approach to rap. And not to say, you know, I think it's always sort of, I don't know if there's like a tinge of racism or something to it, but like there was a lot of that in the 80s and 90s, like leading up to the 2000s. So it's not like, you know, that was invented basically when white people started rapping, but, you know, like that was, you know, like a huge, I mean, that was what rap was. It was emotive, but, you know, Josh definitely had his own unique take on that. But I always think of Josh. So that was the thing about All Friended Up, was when he did that, I remember he played it for me, and, you know, Josh is an extremely talented producer, and I knew he was a good MC, but that's one of the best. So Burner would be like, there's not like a particular topic, somebody just talking shit. That's one of the best Burner verses I've ever heard. He just comes out coming after you. And there's this funny meme that I've seen after Kobe Bryant died. It's kind of fucked up, but like, it's a picture of Jesus in heaven crossing up Kobe Bryant, and the caption is Jesus saying, you thought shit was sweet up here. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I envisioned Josh up in heaven, like looking down on people listening to All Friended Up, who some people might have been like, oh, like, you know, it was too personal. And I was like, oh, you thought the shit was sweet, huh? Like, he just really pivoted. And I've never been, you know, particularly intimidated or shy about like sharing a song with other people. I enjoy the challenge, but with that song, I was like, man, you really better come with it. And the initial version of it that I did, I just laid down something just to get a feel for, a lot of different nuances of the beat. And Josh ended up playing it on a podcast that I was co-hosting called Chrome Bills. And I was like, don't play it, because my part was not nearly as good as his. And I actually redid it, rewrote it twice, just so I could be on par with Josh. So to that point, that sort of leads me back to answering your question about the yin and the yang of all those different approaches to writing. I mean, I feel like a lot of it has to do with parameters. So, when you're painting, whatever canvas you're using, the size of it, is kind of what your parameters are. And, even Jackson Pollock, like he wasn't just like walking down the street splashing paint on people. There was like a certain dimension to whatever canvas he was working on. So in music, that would be the beat. And you can get meta and sort of go outside of it, or do like a 10-minute song when typically 3.5, 4 minutes is the length that you're shooting for. I can't say I've ever done a rap song that isn't 4/4 rhythm. So, that's another parameter to work within. Certainly when I was younger, I felt more beholden to traditions within rap and word choice and things like that, and actually rhyming. I feel like Anticon was a real standard bearer in not rhyming, but remaining on beat on 4/4 stuff. So I always liked listening to their stuff. Never particularly worked great when I tried it, but so there's certain parameters to that. With the poetry stuff, I always enjoyed writing that because there wasn't, and not that when I sit down and write a rap song that I'm checking off boxes. It's still mostly by feel that, when I'm done with the song or sort of got a rough draft or get an idea of where I'm going with the song. Sure, it's on beat. Sure, it does this, that, and the third that would fit in the box of hip hop. But I also just feel in my heart and soul that that's what it should be. That song should be. With poetry, there was no like helmet to wear, no seatbelt to put on. There was no safety net. And that was exhilarating. And it was also sort of a really good exercise, because sometimes I'd write something and I was like, yeah, like you could say that, but that's fucking stupid. Like that's not good poetry. And, it's good to be able to have, I guess in that sense, that was a parameter. But when I would write something and I would feel that it was good, but didn't really have any tangible explanation as to why, that was thrilling and exhilarating. So the poetry book that I have is called Easier Dead Than Numb. And as the title would suggest, I think it's a pretty dark book, but I think that there's some pretty funny, lighthearted moments. But for the most part, it's a pretty razor, like wrist-slitting kind of approach to poetry. And I enjoy doing that. I think as I got older and met my wife and had kids, and I've had a lot more positive experiences, particularly since I met my wife. Like I'm not going to sit and write this like suicidal poetry book. You know what I mean? Like, right. I don't particularly
hand it to your wife and be like, tell me what you think.
Yeah.
Babe. And she's like, wow, this is really dark.
I will say one of my favorite things to do, so in terms of writing is, I'll make no excuses for it because the NFL is a pretty disgusting entity, but I love watching the NFL. I always have since I was a kid. So I love writing about it, particularly just being a, smarmy dickhead. And I feel like that writing is very challenging. Like the parameters of that are so narrow. But within that, like you can sort of, like Kurt Vonnegut, I felt like was one of those, he was a very good writer at having like an 8-sentence paragraph. And the only part of it that was funny were the last 3 words, but everything leading up to that made those last words land. But I feel like that kind of writing, particularly about sports, is always a challenge. I've been doing those every week during this season, up until the holidays, and then just recently with the Even a Death album coming out, I sort of let it slide. And I'm a Chiefs fan, and they just completely shit the bed. I don't know if you guys follow any of that stuff, but so I haven't written one in a while, but I really enjoy that too. If someone would ever pay me for that, I would love to do that. I think I'd rather get paid to do that than get paid like the 0.0001 cents you get paid for Spotify.
Right. What is your favorite show that you ever played? You and Cubby ever played together? Do you have a night that stands out to you for some reason? And why does it stand out to you? Why is it one of those, like, because I think anybody who performs on stage has those nights that just, you can remember the date and everything, and you're not sure why, but that night was just different than any other night. What do you think was one of your most memorable, and why?
So I'll give you two answers. So the first thing I'll say was, so I had done a couple tours. And, I wasn't playing, like I wasn't opening for U2 or anything like that. Like the first couple of tours I did were real shoestring budget, playing in people's basements. I would go out as educated consumers, but I would go out on the road alone. And then after I'd done that a couple of times, I linked up with a guy named Dez from Albany. And he's part of a really solid group called Pig Food Records. And Dez and I toured together a handful of times. And once we sort of had our feet underneath us of how to do that, we took Cubby along on Cubby's first tour. So like his first experience touring. And that was awesome in terms of just getting him new experiences. So a lot of those shows were really cool, but they were more about, like me or Dez, there's not really one of those shows on that particular tour that stands out to me. Is actually there is, but first let me tell you this funny story. So I think we were going from Albany to Buffalo, and there must have been some, like, that's what it was. We had played in New York City. We were going to Buffalo. There was some like triangulation that happened where basically Josh put the wrong address in the GPS, and we went 2 hours out of our way before he was like, "Oh fuck, I put the wrong address in." And I can't remember if it was Buffalo or Albany or what. Like it was one of those things where we, with all those shows, it was like, get to the venue by 7. Like you're lucky if you go on by 10. Like nobody, we weren't really chipping it, but it was just so fucking funny because it was such a big fuck up, but it wasn't a big deal. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
So that was really funny. And so that was sort of an inside joke. I don't think we let Josh use the GPS the rest of the tour, but I remember that specifically. But in terms of my favorite shows, I mean, for that particular tour, so I'll give outside of Baltimore, and then I'll give an inside of Baltimore. For that particular tour, the first time Dez had played in Albany, I think that may have been the last stop, or like Dez had really gotten his feet underneath him in terms of performing for new people. I think when he had performed in Baltimore, it was mostly, his fan base, which was building up over time, but you get used to seeing the same faces. There's not the same nerves. Whereas in Albany, I think that, and everybody up there was cool as shit, but no one was going to like throw a brick at him or anything. But I think there's that sort of like, oh shit, I got to earn my stripes tonight kind of thing.
Right.
And seeing Cubby in that 5th or 6th show, whatever, like he fucking killed it. And a lot of people that, the purpose of Dez and I bringing him on that tour was, to get him exposure, get him his sea legs in terms of touring. But there was like our friends in these areas that we wanted to get them exposed to really good music. And so Josh really killed it that night. And I remember people were really impressed. But in terms of my favorite show or shows with him, I mean, every time he played in Baltimore, that's where he lived. Like I don't consider myself like from DC or Maryland or Virginia. That's just not, I guess I've moved around enough and it's not really my style. Josh was very rooted in Baltimore. Like he was such a Baltimore guy, and he worked at Charles Village Pub. He lived in an apartment above it, Charles Village Pub down, off St. Paul. Playing in Baltimore for him, I think was like Drake playing in Toronto. Or that kind of thing. Where it was like it's extra special. Yes, there's more people. Because it's your hometown. But those shows, I just always remember watching people who had seen dozens of his shows hanging on every word and, standing at the front, not tuning out because they'd seen it all before. Like, those were always a lot of fun. My favorite show was definitely the one. So it was me and him. We opened for Sage Francis. And it's funny because one of the reasons that I first wanted to meet Josh was in the early 2000s, as educated consumers, I was getting all the shows with the Rhyme Sayers acts in DC and Baltimore, but I would never get the Sage Francis shows. because Cubby was. And so that was sort of like a nice, coming around time as a flat circle kind of thing that we both got to open up for him, for Sage in Baltimore. Because Sage is just, like one of the archetype, of I think a lot of the stuff that Josh and I did and have done and will do. Sage is just, one of the best at it. So that was really cool. And also, it's funny because I was good friends with Idea, and we toured with him a bunch of times. And it always took me a while with people like Idea and Sage, whose music I had listened to just, hundreds of times before I actually met.
Sure.
To accept it that, it was like, they're not just like throwing us a bone by having us on stage. They like what we do.
Right.
So don't fuck it up, But
right.
And I think that being able to share that experience with Josh, and we talked about it, was like, this is crazy. Like, that these people, we're approaching the level that they are, at least artistically is sort of mind blowing.
Yeah.
I remember the Epic Beardmen were on a tour and they had to stop at, this is crazy, Comet Pizza, which is famous for being the Pizzagate place. So I remember at the time being like, I think I'd still done enough sets where I always liked to practice, but I don't know if Sage asked to do if I would do the show or not, but I remember maybe he did. At some point I was like, I don't think I can do the show because like with our son coming, we've already got, at the time our daughter was 18 months, I was like, I don't think I can allocate, even if I did have the time because I'll be awake because the kids won't be sleeping, like the energy and focus to prepare for a show like that. And then I remember being at the show, it's like, you fucking idiot. Like you're not up there, like it's not rocket science. Like, of course you could have done the show. And I went to the show and I remember my wife was like, I know it's important to you to go to the show. And that was a big lift on her part, considering, having like a week-old kid.
So my one last question is, we've sort of centered this whole conversation around the Even in Death album. And I guess my last, major question is there anything about that album that you wish people knew that they don't know?
That's a very good question. I'm trying to think of it from like a technical standpoint. So I think the song Even in Death, I've said this elsewhere, but so it's really cool in that, I mentioned earlier that Alexander Brown, this was before he was in the mix in terms of mixing it and mastering it. It crossed his radar that we were doing the record. And he sent me this beat and he was like, this is something Josh and I worked on. I only have it as an MP3. And Rick, I'm sure I'll just be retreading stuff that and Sarah probably you too. So for the audience out there who's not super familiar with what goes into making the song. So like all the individual elements, the drums, so the bass, the kick, the hi-hat, the snare, the bass line, the piano samples, all of those things would typically be tracked out individually. So when you look at a studio and the huge mixing board, all of those individual knobs would be assigned to an individual instrument. And that's how things are able to really get mixed and sound just amazing, because you're able to do it individually and then put them all together. Sure. If all you have is an MP3 of something, like it's very compressed and flat sounding, and
sure.
It's challenging to make that palatable. And so when Alexander Brown sent me that beat, I mean, immediately I was like, holy shit, like this is the exact tone and vibe that I need to write sort of the capstone song for this record. But it's an MP3, like this is going to sound like shit, But so I want people to know that the reason that we went ahead with it was the beat is very good. Alexander Brown, we knew would be able to make, like chicken salad out of it for sure. Like he was able to just to spruce it up and not like in a putting lipstick on a pig kind of way. But I also always thought that Josh's music, it has like a certain polish to it, but it's also got a lot of imperfection to it. I would record vocals, 50 times until I got it right. He would do a take, and if he flubbed a word here or there, but the emotion was there, he was like, it just feels right, I'm going to keep that. So I think that the beat for Even in Death has some imperfection to it, but what I did with that song was, that's a song where I sort of spell out my relationship with Cubby and try to do him justice in terms of talking about his career. And it's a pretty somber song, but there's a lot of Easter eggs throughout the song of me referencing Josh's songs. So typically, like the last line, not the last line in each verse, but sort of like the fourth line in each verse is some allusion to one of Josh's songs or a play off of that. So,
Sure.
I think if you're familiar with his catalog, you might have picked up on that.
Yeah.
But
I heard you say Contra and that.
Yeah. So, those are always the fun kind of things. I'm trying to think. I'm sure I'll think of something like tomorrow when I'm at work and just be like, oh, you idiot. How did you not think of this? But I'll say that, I will say this, that there was this side of Josh that was a lot of fun. I think that his music, like you said, there was a certain like diary sense to it. And sometimes I think it was always entertaining, but it was dark. He was such a fun person to hang out and have a beer with. And he wasn't like Edgar Allan Poe, at the bar, like sitting there. He was a really funny guy, had a really good sense of humor. I'll tell you a funny anecdote. While he was alive, the working title of the record that we were going to do was You Die at the End. And so like the first working session that we had together to go over the material that we already had, he was like, well, I think maybe we should change the name because given the circumstances, You Die at the End feels a little on the nose. Right.
Yeah.
It was like he deadpanned it, and it was just such a fucking hysterical thing to say. And he was a really funny person. And so, while he was here, certainly it was a lot of fun to work on. But even after that, working on it, I had a lot of good memories of working on music together. But, I feel like with those kind of relationships, what you remember most was like driving, like we did a show in Columbus one day. Like I remember our conversation there on the way back. I don't remember a whole lot about the show, itself.
Yeah.
What I want the audience to know is that Josh was a very fun and, despite what his music might have made you think, he was a pretty happy guy, which is a good thing to know, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Rick had said that, a lot of our questions were centered around this album and the work that went into it. I wanted to ask you, what's going on next for you? What's happening in the future for you? Do you have any upcoming plans? What's your art look like for the next year, 2022?
Awesome. So in 2000, up till about 2016, before I got married, I had wanted to, either as Educated Consumers or as a solo act, I wanted to get picked up by Rhyme Sayers or Strange Famous, have a label that I'd put out my records, put me on tour, all that stuff. And then once I got married and realized we were going to have kids and realized I was pretty old. At that point, I'd always arbitrarily given myself to the age of 35. And my wife and I met. I can't remember how old I was, but too old for her. But I just reached a point where I was like, I still want to make music. I just don't want to do all the other bullshit that comes along with it. And then when Strange Famous Records started SF Digi, the digital subsidiary, where they're like, give us your album, we'll put it out on our digital platforms. Thus, there's no overhead and there's no cost to recoup. And you just make music, and you don't have to worry about going out on tour and stuff. I was like, all right, this is perfect. Let me put my money where my mouth is. That all I want to do is make music, so that's all I have to do now. So, I'd like to think I've been pretty prolific since that. So, one of the things that I put out pre SF Digi was an album called With, and With is produced entirely by Scott Kuzner. And the approach I took to that album was each song is me with two other MCs. So like Chesky Ramos is on one of those songs. A lot of people from the DMV are on the songs, Napoleon the Legend, a whole bunch of people. So what I wanted to do was make With into a serial. So like With 1, With 2, With 3. And there's a guy that I've known for a long time named Speaks. He's based out of Tokyo right now. He hit me up with a beat a couple years ago. It was just an absolute banger. I said, send me another one, another banger, another banger, another banger. To the point where I said, instead of just getting one or two songs from you beats from you for an album, let's just do an EP together. and let's do the second with together. Like, you give me the beats. It's easier for me to write the hook and the verse, and I'll reach out to people and say, will you jump on this? And then I thought, well, now that I'm with Strange Famous, why don't I just do this all with Strange Famous MCs? So Sage Francis is on one of the songs. Prolific is on one of the songs. Runt from Jivin' Scientist is on one of the songs. Swell from Meter Maids is on one of the songs. I'm going to do a song with Black Lick, who's one of the more recent additions. So super excited about that. That album's actually done because we knew Even in Death was coming out in the first quarter of 2022. I guess 2021, 22. I knew that album wouldn't be coming out, anytime soon. So I was glad that we got a chance to sit on it. And now that I can add the song with Black Lick, whenever that gets done, that will drop later on this year, or early next year. Sort of, bless you. Up to the label. I mean, if it was up to me, I'd be like, let's do it next week, but there's a reason the labels run the shit, and they're like, you just put something out, calm down. So that will come out. There's another record I'm super excited about that I've been working on. So another one of the Strange Famous artists is this guy named Alpheus. He's based out of the UK, makes incredible beats, and he put out an album on Strange Famous called Megalith, and primarily it's beats. So he was like, Josh was an MC and a producer, but had this sort of like industrial sound. And I would say that that's what Alpheus is sort of like. So he and I traded songs. I did a song called Macro Mirror on Megalith, and the video for that is so cool. It's a kaleidoscope video of my hideous face, but just go into YouTube and type in Seez Mics Macro Mirror, and it's an awesome video. So then he did a beat on my Strange Famous debut, Live Long Enough to Learn, called My Pin Code to Everything. And we'd always talked about doing an album together, in the same, it's funny, like in the same way that I talked to Josh about doing one. And sometimes you catch lightning in a bottle. Like with two, it's easier to write because I'm just doing a verse and a hook for that particular song. Whereas with Orpheus or some of the Cubby stuff, it was like, I'm doing the whole song by myself. I got to take a little bit more time. The stuff Orpheus and I have done, it's so cool. It's very different, almost in the way that it was like working with Cubby initially, where there's times I'll write something, I'm like, damn, like you really could do that to it, and still have it be sort of the, a rap song. So that album, it's going to be an EP. I think it's a pretty intense listen, pretty, like used to buy like the concentrate version of like orange juice. You'd have to like mix it into water, so like because you couldn't drink like that. This record is just the concentrate. You don't add any water to it.
I'm excited to hear it. Based on your description, it's exactly the type of music that I would be drawn to.
It's very cool. It's I don't even want to, but the title is one of like, just as somebody who writes poetry and stuff like that. Like I think it's such a good title, but I'm not gonna say it. But yeah, I'm super excited about that one. I don't think that will be out for, maybe 2023. But because it's an EP, we'll wrap it up and then mix and master it, let it sit and marinate for 6 months, come back to it, tweak it. But that's, I'm excited about everything I'm doing, but those two, with two, and the album that I can't tell you the title of, those are
no spoilers. Yeah. No spoilers allowed.
It's been awesome. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about after this album is dropped is interacting with, I think we were talking about doing an interview beforehand once I knew the album was going to come out, but getting to interact with good people like you guys has been a really nice aspect of the album coming out. So thank you very much for having me on.
And
where can people find you? Where's the best places online people can go to get the music and get your music and get this album and everything?
So I hate Spotify for a lot of reasons, but it's very convenient and centralized. So if you type in SeezMics, all of the stuff that I've done as a solo act is on there. I encourage you to go to strangefamousrecords.com, not just for my own music, but I think every artist on Strange Famous is really dope, really well handled by the label. And the best place to get Even in Death is on the Seez Mics, Cubbiebear, Strange Famous, Bandcamp, any of those three. If you go to strangefamousrecords.com, Even in Death is, I think, on the homepage. You click there. There's a limited run of T-shirts. You can buy the 7-inch, which is a very unique item. There's only going to be 50 of those made, and it's got All Friended Up and Even in Death as the singles on there. But, you know, if you're like me and just sort of get lazy at times, but still want to stay in tune with stuff, Spotify, YouTube, you know, those are definitely the places to go. But I encourage people to pick up merch. For sure, like physical copies of that. That's always helpful. I also did want to say that we are working on a way for the profits from this record to be donated in Cubbie's name to the right place. We're working on figuring out how to do that on an annual basis, and Josh's brother Bill is the driving force behind that. You know, there's cost to recoup, but after that, all of the profits will be going to the right place. And I've always said, I mean, Josh had a huge reach while he was alive. I think posthumously, this album's gonna do very well. It might be the highest grossing album that I've ever been on, and I won't see a dime of it. And I think Josh would have loved that.
We reserve this for our guests. This is the final word. So if this was your chance right now, and this was your chance to give a message to the whole world, and this is your last chance to do it, what would it be?
Stop dehumanizing people that you disagree with. I think the biggest thing that humans do cyclically is lose sight of the fact that what separates us from any other species on this planet is our ability to reason and resolve things through dialogue. And we just keep coming back in circles to violence and, you know, ad hominem attacks and might makes right kind of things. I think that I'm very fearful for my children's future that disagree with somebody, you feel like you have to dehumanize them as opposed to at least hear them out.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Thank you so much, man. Thank you.
Dude. And please keep us in mind for your future releases.
I absolutely will. Thank you, guys.
Good.
I appreciate you having me on.
I'm Cubbiebear, Seez Mics.
My heart's racing.
Our tears pooled together like the money that we raised, none of which could save you, but some of which we saved, so your memory can live on in a world you grew to hate. Despite the love that grew out of the world you helped create, you were always so serious, you were always so hilarious, you were always so sincere, you were always there to care for us. And even in death I hear you say, everyone, are you okay? Well, we don't have the answers for the questions asked by cancer. And all those jokes we made about what a shitty place this is must have been laughing at us while you lay silently in that bed. You couldn't speak, I couldn't stop, the world just kept on dying. Life could never tame you, but that never stopped it from trying. The first time we met was hysterically awkward. Anyone listening, ask me about it sometime. It's good to reflect, you learn to accept a little fear can't eclipse sunshine. I had a friend named Josh and a peer named Cubbiebear. If he wasn't making masterpieces, he was cutting hair. The paradox of searching for peace and finding nothing there. What you found, oh what you found, a place of solace for all the lost kids. Such a sound, yes such a sound, explosive, caustic, firebox it. Baltimore's least willing prophet, most obvious prospect for drawing a line in the sand just to cross it. A concert don't mean we're in concert, but I guess that's what made your mantra contra. On the night you died, I cried inside, but felt relief and said out loud, I'm glad your pain is over. Hello, I hope you're better now. I was a fan and a friend, you were a friend and a fan. You taught me what it meant to die like a man. Life is so annoying cause I can no longer share it with you. Our tears pooled together like the money that we raised, none of which could save you, but some of which we saved, so your memory can live on in a world you grew to hate. Despite the love that grew out of the world you helped create, you were always so serious, you were always so hilarious, you were always so sincere, you were always there to care for us. And even in death I hear you say, everyone, are you okay? But we don't have the answers. Fuck cancer.
Let's going to be hard for me to do something you don't want to do. It's going to be hard for me to not do something you want to do. Well, then we're in a pickle. It's a great place to be. I love pickles. Hunting constellations in a North Carolina night. Our next crane sitting on the roof. I found Pisces and Capricorn. Hey look, you're right next to me. Yep, right here and in the sky. When you die, send me stars. When I die, I'll send you butterflies.